Good afternoon, everybody.
Good
So glad
afternoon.
y'all could come out and be with us today. I'm Blake Tyner. I'm a local historian and author, and I work at the Museum of Southeast American Indians. So we're really glad we can come meet with you today. I've got with me Ben Chavis.
Ben Clark.
I'm sorry, Ben Clark. I've done
Ben
that twice
Clark.
today.
But I'm a recent graduate of UNCP. I just graduated with a history degree and an American Indian Studies degree. So I
And
also
he
work with
managed to
Blake.
go out and find a grant to get himself a job at our museum. So he's got funding, and he's helping us with the museum now. He does a great job doing tours for us at the museum. So we're going to sort of tag team this. We'll be going back and forth between the two of us, and it is all yours.
All right, so our topic for today is Lumbee history and culture, but we'll really just begin with the beginning history of the Lumbee people. So if you're not familiar, the Lumbee is settled in and around Robeson County and the surrounding counties. But really where we hail from is a mixture of tribes. So if you look up here, it's kind of blurry, but I have several different tribes that are from Virginia. And if you're familiar, Jamestown, which was the first settlement in the North American continent, was founded in 1607 up in Virginia. Founded up here at the coast, and you can imagine that after its founding, there was a lot of disease that began to spread amongst native people, and war kind of happened. And so there was a lot of movement and displacement of indigenous people up in the Virginia area. And if you go, we'll go to the next slide. Then you have these tribes here in the North Carolina region, excuse me. And the first settlement in North Carolina was Bath in 1705. So about 100 years later, you have a settlement here on the coast of North Carolina. And again, disease, warfare, that kind of thing. Again, displaced native people. And with that displacement, you had a lot of native people flowing, in the interior state and then south into modern day Robeson County. The reason being is Robeson County, in that time was very swampy. It was filled with nothing but water, and so it was really unwanted land by Europeans. And so native people, as living here for forever, we knew how to manage water. We knew how to live in a swamp. And so native people from Virginia, from North Carolina, and even down in South Carolina, they started to flood into Robeson County as a means of hiding, as a means of protection, as a means of way to avoid warfare with Europeans and avoid diseases. So that's really where you get the beginning history of native people coming into Robeson County. And like I said, it's a mixture of all these different people. So each tribe particularly spoke a different language, and if they did speak the same language, it was a different dialect. So you have all these different native people coming into Robeson County, such as, the Kiowa, the Sherrall, the Hatteras, the Tuscarora, all hailing from the Eastern Siouan, Algonquin, and Iroquois and tribal languages. And you get them settling in the Lumbee River Basin. Today, the Lumbee tribe has over 53,000 enrolled members, and it's the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. We're the 9th largest tribe in the United States, and throughout history, our name has changed, but Blake will get into that history.
Building on what he said about swamps, lots of times when I give my programs, I said Robeson County is really just one big swamp with a few high places in it. We've got 50 designated swamps. And used to, back before there were towns, you were actually identified by what swamp you lived on. You lived on Hog Swamp, Panther Swamp. So, in 1885, Hamilton McMillan, who was a lawyer and a member of the North Carolina House, became very involved with the Indians that would later become the Lumbee. He spent years researching them, interviewing older members of the tribe. And in 1885, he came up with the decision that the Indians of Robeson County were a mixture of the Lost Colony settlers and the Croatan Indians that were there around Roanoke, and that over the years they had migrated south because when the first white settlers came into Robeson County, they found blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indians that they could not account for. They were already living in housing like white settlers lived in. Originally, the lodging would have been these huge dove houses or wigwams. and it would have been a communal living. Those buildings were so big, sometimes there were 300 to 500 people living in this huge building, which would have been a round building. And as we tell our kids, the reason it was round is because it helped with the hurricanes and the winds that we had here in North Carolina. If you've got a flat structure, you're going to get more damage from the wind. But in 1885, it was also the 300th anniversary of the Lost Colony's disappearance. So it was a very romanticized period. So Hamilton McMillan went before the North Carolina House and the Senate, and he said, these are the Croatan Indians. We need to recognize them as the Croatan Indians. So the state voted to name them the Croatan Indians. He also then worked with, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but he worked with 7 leaders in the Lumbee Nation to create in 1887 UNC Pembroke, where we both work. So the tribe has gone, in 1885, they were Croatan Indians. Since then, they have gone through a number of name changes. By 1911, Croatan was sort of a slur. They took it as, it had become an unwanted name. So they went to the North Carolina House and the Senate, and they said, we need a new name. So in their wisdom, the North Carolina General Assembly renamed them Indians of Robeson County. That lasted for 2 years, and in 1913, they renamed them the Cherokee Indians of Robeson County, which did not go over well with the Cherokees in the mountains at all. And the tribe is still feeling the effects of that name change 100 years later, because the Cherokee has been sort of the most outspoken group fighting them for federal recognition all these years. Finally, in 1952, the Indians decided to vote for themselves on a name. So they picked the name Lumbee, taking it from the Lumber River, which they called the Lumbee. It passed like 200 votes against, 2,400 for. They went to the General Assembly and I said, this is the name we want. So they renamed them. And this was the first time, like I said, they had been allowed to name themselves. This map is one of the earliest documents showing the Indian communities in the Drowning Creek area. And it was prepared in 1725 by the Indian Commissioner John Herbert. And in 1954, it was reported that there was an Indian settlement consisting of 50 families along Drowning Creek. The same year, Governor Matthew Rowan proclaimed that the county of Anson was the frontier to the Indians, and Drowning Creek formed the border between Anson and Bladen counties. The Lumbee tribe found once that they were confronted with white contact that the best way to survive was to assimilate into the white culture. So they began speaking English, doing the same agricultural practices, and became Christians. The term was that a good Indian was a live Indian. If you didn't act like you were a real Indian, then you had a better chance. But Lumbees have been involved since the very beginning in things. They were they served in the Revolutionary War, in the War of 1812. But in 1835, the General Assembly passed they revised the state constitution, and the Lumbees were classified as free persons of color. They lost their right to bear arms and their right to education.
And vote.
They also lost a lot of their civil rights. Now, the next big thing in Lumbee history was Henry Berry Lowry. Does anybody here know about Henry Berry Lowry? The locals will know who we're talking about. So, everybody has their take on Henry Berry Lowry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you what the chair of the Indian Studies program wrote about the Henry Berry Lowry War. Then I'm going to move over to letters that were written by the whites at that time. So, it says the degradation experienced by the Lumbees intensified with the onset of the Civil War because of their altered legal status. Lumbee men were not allowed to fight for the South. Yet some were constricted by the Confederacy and shipped to Fort Fisher on the North Carolina coast to construct defense fortifications and make salt. Conditions at Fort Fisher were extremely harsh. Starvation, disease, and unsanitary working conditions forced the Lumbees to either escape their bondage or to simply refuse to go. Many hid in the terrain of the swamps and the bottomlands to evade the local militia. It was not long, however, before the continued denial of basic liberties, combined with increasing racial tensions within Robeson County, created a volatile climate for the Lumbees. that was destined to explode. The growing conflict between the Indians and whites finally erupted in 1865 in what was known as the Lowry War, one of the most violent times in Lumbee history and in the white history in Robinson County. There were many events leading to the Lumbee War. The most immediate cause, however, was the murder of prominent Lumbee farmer Allen Lowry and his son William, who were accused of aiding Union soldiers, hiding weapons, and stealing property from local plantation owners. Allen, William, and other family members were arrested on March the 3rd, 1865 by the local militia, carried off into a nearby field, had a speedy trial by the home guard, found guilty, and executed all within an hour from their arrest. According to Lumbee history, the youngest Lowry son, Henry Berry, was hiding close by in the bushes and witnessed the murder of his father and brother. The image of his slain family was forever seared in his mind and quickly transformed Henry's well-known hatred for the home guard into a desperate need for vengeance. Vowing to kill all who had anything to do with the murder of the two Lowrys, Henry, at the age of 16, with his band of militia, began a lengthy war against the injustice suffered by the Lumbee. His exploits became legendary. No jail was able to hold him. The swamp shielded him from capture, and the superb marksmanship who single-handedly held 18 militiamen at bay while shooting from behind an overturned boat in the middle of the Lumber River. Stealing from the rich while sharing with the poor, the 19th century Indian Robin Hood ensured himself protection by the surrounding community. Despite his elusiveness, however, Henry Berry disappeared in 1872, following the final raid on Lumberton, the county seat. To this day, no conclusive explanation about what happened to him has been found. There was a $12,000 bounty for his capture offered by the state legislature that was never collected. The burial site of his purported slain body has never been found. If surviving members of the family or the band knew of his fate, they have never revealed it. Yet to the Lumbees, the mystery of Henry Berry only enhances the legend. And in every Lumbee family, there's an account of the real story of Henry Berry and the Lowry War. As we know, everybody has their own take on everything. But over a century later, the impact of the war is still being felt. So this is a picture that we believe to be Henry Berry. In the probably the past 15 years, there's been an argument made that it was not him, that it was another man. But I actually found in my collection a copy of the photograph that was done by a Lumberton photographer from 1911, and she was only here from 1911 to 1916. So she's stating that it was him at that time that she had met with his family and got it. These are members of his gang. This was an article that was in Harper's Weekly, and it shows, his gang out in the woods shooting. This is a take on him shooting from the water. And then these were three of the members. We'll talk about Henderson Locklear, he will, a little bit later.
I do want to mention, though, that the gang, it was not just composed of Lumbee men. It was a tri-racial gang, so it was mostly composed of Lumbees. But there was also a Buckskin Scot and from the Laurinburg area around here, and there were also two runaway slaves. So one of them is pictured here, George Applewhite, and then the other one his name was Shoemaker John. So I wanted to mention that.
Yes, thank you. Now, chasing after Henry Berry Lowry was Francis Marion Wishart from Maxon, which was Shoe Hill at the time. He had been a Confederate officer, came back, and was sort of put in charge of the militia that tried to track Henry Berry. This is a picture of three of his fellow militiamen who were doing the hunting. And this is actually the body of Henry Berry's brother, Thomas, or Tom Lowry, down at the bottom. When I published my first book, I cut that picture off and didn't show his body. And several Lumbees were very upset. They said, well, you're not telling the whole story. We want the whole picture in there because we've got it hanging up in the tribal offices. So I've learned that sometimes what we think is something sensitive actually is more of an insult to somebody. And
if I'm not mistaken, too, they actually have the pistol that Tom was carrying. So. And the ammunition box up in the History Museum in Raleigh. Yeah. So it's pretty cool to look at.
So to tell Wishart's side of the story, I'm going to read a couple of letters that were written to him. So this one was July 19th, 1871. It says, Captain F.M. Wishart. Said we had a company of 25 or 30 volunteers. 4 or 5 of us were outlawed by H.B. Lowry and his gang. We would be glad if you would send us 4 or 5 good rifles if you have them. Send to Shoe Hill, care of C. McRae. By doing so, we will be very much obliged. Then later that month, on August the 24th, he got a letter from the sheriff saying, "Come to Lumberton immediately. There are 16 men, all volunteers at Shoe Hill, all waiting for you. Also a company of United States soldiers at this place who are going up tomorrow." For the locals to accept help from the U.S. soldiers so quickly after the end of the Civil War did not go well with everybody. And you'll see in the next letter, attached to that letter is a letter from J.C. Corbin, who was the Adjutant General of North Carolina. He writes, "Colonel Wishart, I am permitted to add to this letter. I arrived this morning and will be leaving for Bowie's Store tomorrow, Friday, with 50 U.S. soldiers, and confidently expect to meet you and your command ready for work. I am fearful that if the citizens do not cooperate immediately with the troops, they will return. If they do this will be the last time we send troops to Robeson County. Come immediately." So, Wishart's last letter was written August the 28th, 1871. He wrote to the Adjutant General. He said, "I am to meet with the Lowry gang tomorrow at 8 o'clock near this place to try and get them out of the county. I'm risking my life at the hands of desperadoes. If I am never heard from again, you will know what became of me. I am doing this for my county and my state, as I have nothing at stake. For if it is for other men's sake, not my own, for I could easily leave and go where Lowry could not follow. But I have a wife and 3 children. If I am killed, see that they are cared for and my children educated. It is a great risk to run. It is a great risk to run by one who has so many times been threatened by these same fellows. For the sake of peace and to end this trouble, I am risking it. I hope and trust in God and will go. If I do not return, avenge my death 100-fold. Duff Cummings has my confidence. Very respectfully yours, F.M. Wishart." And the next morning he was killed at that meeting of the 2. His children did go on, though, on the other hand, to be educated. His son became the vice president of the New York Railroad under Vanderbilt. So Ben is going to talk now about Henderson's story.
So this is probably one of my favorite members of the gang, simply because of his story. So to my knowledge, there was a time where his sister was actually giving birth. He was out on the road, with the gang, and he hadn't seen his family in forever. And so when he gets word that his sister is having a baby, he's like, "I really, really, really want to go see my sister, my family, and I really want to be there for my niece or nephew," right? So he leaves the gang, and the gang actually warned him, like, "Henderson, please don't, we know you haven't seen your family. We haven't seen ours either, but please don't go because there might be a risk for your capture. You might be captured and you might be executed." But Henderson, he still wanted to see his family. So he actually ends up leaving the gang's hideout. There was a little hideout that no one really knows where the gang hid from, and it's called the Devil's Den. But he leaves the Devil's Den, and he goes and he meets with his sister, and he stays there that night, and he witnesses the birth of his sister's child. And during his sleep, while he's asleep, the house is actually surrounded by militiamen. The word spreads throughout the town that Henderson Oxendine is, in town. So a group of militiamen, like I said, surrounded that home that he was in, and they drag him out, and they tell him that he's going to be executed the next day. So I can imagine, the fear and the panic that he had, and also the regret for not staying behind with the gang. But that next day, March the 17th, 1871, he was marched on the gallows, and he was given his last request. So he was asked, what is your last words? What is your last thing that you want to do? And so he looks at everybody, and back then, executions were public. People would go and they would sit down with picnics, and they would eat, and they would watch someone be murdered. But he looks at everybody, he says, "The last thing that I want to do on this earth is I want to sing." So everybody present that day, they go down to the local church, they grab some hymn books, and they give Henderson one, and he's up there, and he Imagine has the noose around his neck. And he opens the book and he sings Amazing Grace. And he sings two other songs that day. But the last song that he sings is Amazing Grace. And the people in the crowd, they said that his voice, he sang so beautifully that it touched their hearts, and that they felt that watching him die would have been wrong. I know Henderson and the gang, they did some pretty bad stuff, but bad stuff was done to them. But the people there present that day, like again, they were touched by his voice. And everybody that was present to watch his execution packed their bags and they left. They left because like I said, it touched them in a way. So every time that I see Henderson or I think about the Lowry War, I think about and I imagine the touch and the voice that he had and the fight that he had, for his people to stand up and to fight against the injustices that were being done. But I can just imagine, I would have loved to have heard his voice and witnessed that thing that day, even though it might have been bad too. But I would have loved to have heard his voice, listened to him sing. That just blows my mind that the last thing that he did was sing. But that's the story of Henderson Oxenine.
Okay, I said a little bit earlier that in 1887, 2 years after the Croatans were named the Croatans, Hamilton McMillan was again in the news. He was working with a group of 7 local leaders in the Lumbees to create what is now the University of North Carolina, Pembroke. So the school was funded to be the Croatan Normal School. Do y'all know what a normal school is?
Yes.
That's a school for educating teachers. So they created this school just to educate those to go out and teach.
To teach teachers how to teach, I say.
The name came from the fact that the school had a list of norms that had to be met
Right.
before you could graduate, which was not common in colleges.
Right.
That's cool.
But the state appropriated $500 to be used per year for teacher salaries, but didn't give any money for funding books, a building, furniture, anything. So the local people came together, raised enough money to build a building and pay for all the needs that were needed to teach. The school opened in the fall of 1887 with 15 students and 1 teacher. And the first diploma was issued in 1905. The first 4-year degree was conferred in 1940, and in recognition of the new status, the General Assembly changed the name to Pembroke College for Indians. And up until 1953, it was the only state-supported 4-year college for Indians in the nation. In 1945, when enrollment previously limited to just Indians of Robeson County, it was opened up to all federally recognized tribes. And in 1949, they shortened the name to Pembroke State College. Then the 50s happened. Anybody know what big thing happened in education in the 50s? What court case was the big court case in the 50s? Brown versus what? The Board of Education, which opened up schools for African Americans to go into. But also it meant that this Indian school could not be just an Indian school. They had to open up for other races. So in 1953, the Board of Trustees set that 40% of the total enrollment could be white. A growth of over 500% followed in the next 8 years, and in 1969, the General Assembly changed the name to Pembroke State University. 3 years later, North Carolina created the North Carolina University system, and we were one of the 16 schools that make up the University of North Carolina system. And it was finally in 1996 that we actually changed from Pembroke State University to the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. In 2005, the governor signed a law declaring that we were North Carolina's historically American Indian University. So Ben is going to talk about a very big thing that happened in Lumbees in 1958.
Yeah, so on January the 18th, 1958, there was a court case going on. It was between an Indian woman.
Well, no, it was a white couple that was divorcing,
Okay.
and it came out that the wife had been having an affair with an Indian.
Okay.
And the judge said from the bench, how dare you do something so despicable as to have an affair with an Indian man?
Yeah, so that court case really, it got the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, who is down in South Carolina, it riled him up. And so he decided to come to Pembroke and, excuse me, pass out some flyers and say that they're going to have, the Ku Klux Klan are going to have a cross burning in Maxton, which is about 10-15 minutes from Pembroke. The local people, the Lumbee people that were there in Pembroke that day, when they got word of it, it said that every single bullet that could be found or be purchased in Pembroke was purchased. And so later that night, the Klansmen, they got together. They had one spotlight. There was a stage, an MC system, and I can imagine as James Catfish Cole was probably going to step on the stage and do his little address and start the cross burning, there was an Indian man who was in the wood line with about 500 plus Lumbee people. One of the Lumbee men stands up, he raises his gun, and he shoots the light out. But when he shoots the light out, this is the 50s, there was one light, so just imagine how pitch black, this is out in the field, pitch black, that fast. So you can imagine the terror that was on the Klansmen's face when they heard that gunshot, and then the only light they had out in the field was gone. And then after that gunshot, all the other Indians started to run onto the field. They were raising their guns. They were shooting up in the air, causing chaos, terrified the Klansmen. So much so that some of the Klansmen, they literally left their wives and children in the cars on the field and was running towards the tree line to escape the Indians. And about a mile down the road, there was the local North Carolina Highway patrolman. He eventually brought some of his police force in there, and he told all the Indians, hey, we need to break this up, we need to settle this down. And he told everybody, hey, go home, watch your favorite TV show, Gunsmoke. And so all the Indians, they went home and they watched their favorite show, Gunsmoke. But that's the story of the Ku Klux Klan. Excuse me.
Can I make a comment?
Yes. Yeah.
I was there.
Really?
I was there. My husband was from Maxton,
Uh-huh.
and we were young and stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And cars were riding by to see what was going on, and I remember when they shot the light out. And then the police came to everybody dispersed like you said. But yes, indeed, it was real.
What's your
Wow.
My name is Marilyn McVicker.
name? Okay, maybe okay. I used to run the museum in Maxton, and I used to live over in Maxton.
That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
We might have to come back and do an interview with
Interview with you.
you.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
To you after the
Okay, all right.
So there is actually an interview though that we did with 3 other people that was present there that day, and it's on our website. But
Yeah.
it's a pretty cool video.
Well, and I haven't given to Nancy, but I've got 4 interviews that I did when I was in Lumbee class, including Kurt, Alicia's daddy. So, all right, you're up again.
Oh, what's this one?
The museum.
Oh, I'm sorry. So this is Old Main. This is the building that me and Blake work in. It was built in 1923. It wasn't the first.
It was the first brick building.
Yeah, it was the first brick building on the new campus. So the original building that you guys seen earlier when we were talking about Hamilton McMillan, that was about a mile and a half from where campus is present today. But this houses the museum, and above us in the second floor, it houses the American Indian Studies Department, and on the back side of the building it has the communication majors, that kind of thing.
And our American Indian Studies program was one of the first in the country. I think there was one other that might have been before us, but we have a wonderful American Indian Studies program. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. So the museum itself is actually 50 years old. So the building, its original purpose in the 20s, it was a big auditorium. It was a place for students could go and have dances. They had a movie theater in there. Sometimes they had funerals in there. So it was just a big gathering place for the town. But then in 72, I believe,
Yes.
1972, an arsonist came in and they burnt the building to the ground. The only thing that was left was the brick exterior. And some of the community members in Pembroke, some were like, this is an old building. It was built in the 20s. Let's tear it down. And then so the other half of the community was like, no, this represents UNCP. This represents us Lumbees. We need to save the building. So there was a whole Save Old Main campaign that actually happened in the 70s. And then in the late 70s, mid to late 70s, they decided to remodel the inside. And then it became the museum.
It was, the plan was to tear it down and to build GPAC, which I know several of y'all might have been over to GPAC because a lot of the residents from here go over there. And the state voted to tear it down. Well, it was a huge outcry, not just from local Indians, but Indians all over. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was very much against it being torn down because it was the first building where a Native American received a 4-year degree from a Native American school. And but like Ben said, it was burned, and the next morning after the fire, Governor Holshouser, which had not been in office very long, stood up on the steps of the remains and said, "We will rebuild this school. This school is very important." And they ended up spending $1.6 million, which was the same amount they spent that same year to build GPAC. So we ended up with 2 new buildings, basically on campus.
Wasn't Shirley Chisholm? She spoke at the Old Main campus.
I think so.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool.
And then this is a
This
picture
is inside the museum, yeah.
And we use this log cabin really with our students. We get thousands of elementary, middle school, high school students. And we talk about what life was like in the 1800s. You'll see we've got corn grinders, and over to the side we've got wash pots and all for cooking and everything. So we talk to them about that. But one of the favorite things in the museum is our pine cone quilt.
Yes, so as we mentioned earlier, we talked about Henry Berry Lowry and the Lowry War. So after Henry's disappearance in 72, I believe, 72, 73.
72.
After Henry disappears, he was married to Rhoda Strong. They had 3 kids. They had Polly, they had Maggie, and then they had Henry Delaware. So Henry Delaware and Polly, they actually leave Robeson County. They were probably, I can imagine, being hounded by local townspeople. Where's your dad? Where's your dad? We want this bounty. Where's your dad? And so I can imagine the reason why they left, right? But Maggie, she stays behind with her mother, Rhoda. And this quilt tells a beautiful love story. And if you guys wouldn't mind, I would love to share that story with you. So Maggie is at home with Rhoda, and there's a guy who lives a few farms down the road. His name is Hezekiah Locklear. And Hezekiah Locklear is just head over heels for Maggie. He thinks that she's the most beautiful woman he's ever laid his eyes on, right? So he musters up the courage to go over to Maggie's house, knocks on the door, says, "Hey, Miss Rhoda, can I speak to Maggie?" And he has a little small talk with her, and he asks her out on a date. So they go out on a couple dates, and he's a young man. He's just starting in life, starting to build a home, starting to plant his fields to make money. Well, eventually, at the time, a woman needed something from a man. They needed a provider. They needed somebody that can make them money and provide for them. And Hezekiah, just starting, couldn't provide that much. So Maggie and him, they go out on a couple of dates, but Maggie catches the eye of another man who's coming through town, and he works in the turpentine business. Makes great money, great money. This is a great opportunity for Maggie to get settled in with a man and to leave Robeson County. Well, this man, he notices Maggie, and he approaches her and he says, "Wow, Maggie, you're beautiful. I have money. I can take care of you. Will you marry me?" Maggie says, "Yeah, I'll marry you." So she actually leaves. She leaves Robeson County, leaves Hezekiah. Mind you, this man's probably, I think he's like 10, 15 years older than Maggie, so he's a little bit older. And she leaves Robeson County with this man. She goes down to Georgia, and she works in the turpentine business with him, making great money. Well, he actually, after their marriage, about a year and a half, 2 years, he actually gets pneumonia, and he dies. And when he dies, he leaves nothing to Maggie. He gives everything, all of his inheritance, to his children in his previous marriage. And so Maggie is in Georgia, and she's like, "How in the world am I going to get back to Robeson County?" So she actually has to work in the turpentine business, get her hands dirty to make her way back up to Robinson County. She works for about 6 months or so, and she finally gets back to Robinson County, and Hezekiah gets word she's in town. Wow. So he says, I really think she's still pretty. Should I go up to her and approach her and talk to her again? And I can imagine he probably goes home to his buddies, and his buddies talks to him and says, you need to go talk to Maggie. You need to go up to her and talk to her. So he finally, after a couple days of her being back in town, he goes up to her. He offers his condolences for the death of her first husband. He says, you know what, Maggie, let's go out on another date. She says, okay, Hezekiah. So he has a little bit more. He has his house set up, but he still doesn't quite have the moolah, the money yet to support Maggie. They go out on a couple of dates, and again, there's this other man that comes to town. He's in the turpentine business too, makes plenty of good money, but this time, this man's different than the first man. He's a lot younger. He's the same age as Maggie. And so they lock eyes with one another in town. Maggie says, he's good looking. He's good looking. He's got good money. So this man asks, he goes up to her, Maggie, you're beautiful. I have plenty of money. Let's go. Maggie says, okay. They leave in the middle of the night. She leaves with him in the middle of the night, packs her bags, and she leaves, marries this man, and leaves Hezekiah absolutely heartbroken. I can imagine he was so devastated. They go to Georgia, the heart of turpentine country, and they're married for about 2 years. He's walking through the pine savannas, I guess, and he gets bit by a poisonous snake. 2 days later, he's gone. So again, Maggie's like, I am stuck. I have no way to get back to Robinson County. So again, she has to work. She finally makes her way back up to Robinson County, and again, Hezekiah's like, man, she's left me twice. I don't know what I should do. But again, he's got a good heart, and she just must have been that beautiful. Hezekiah was a bit different though. His farm had taken off. He was making great money, and he approaches Maggie and says, I'm sorry for the death of your second husband, but let's go out on a date. So she agrees, and they go out on a date, and he actually buys her a purse, a little beaded purse, and a little beaded hairpiece that we actually have in our museum collection, which is really, really cool. And I think he bought a brand new horse and buggy too at the time. So she goes out with him, and I can imagine this third instance of Maggie and another man locking eyes. I can see it in my head. And Hezekiah notices, he's like, hold on. This happened to me twice. I know the pattern. I'm going to put an end to it. So I can imagine he reins that horse in, or mule, or whatever it may have been. And he goes over to Maggie and says, Maggie, please, I've seen you looking at this man across town. Please marry me, please. And Maggie says, what, Hezekiah, you are very persistent, and I like that. And I will marry you on one condition. Never ask me what happened to my father, Henry Berry Lowry. Never ask me about the gang. Never ask about the bounty. Nothing. I don't even want to hear about my daddy. Don't ask me, and I'll marry you on the spot. Hezekiah says, what? I don't have a ring yet, but, hey, let's get married. So they get married, and they're married for 10 years. And during their marriage, Maggie, she actually makes this quilt. And this quilt is very, very special. This picture doesn't do it justice. But in some of the patterns in the quilt, she actually takes some of Hezekiah's old work shirts and work pants that he worked out in the field with, that he possibly couldn't wear or might have been worn out. And she uses some of her fabric from her dresses and aprons, and she makes this quilt. So this quilt has over 30 patches, and it has over 30,000 folds in it. So Maggie, this wasn't like a quilting train. This wasn't multiple women coming together and making this one quilt. This was all one stitch, all Maggie's hand. So this took about, I can imagine, almost probably a couple years, if not 10, their entire marriage for her to make. Maggie does, though. She does leave Hezekiah one last time when she passes away. And again, Hezekiah, he's heartbroken, and he'll never get over this, right? So he keeps this quilt, and the community love it. It's beautiful. So if you look, I wish I could show you these long strips here that's going up. Those would have been bright blood red, and those little tiny squares, those would have been like a dark forest green. So this quilt was very vibrant, very, very vibrant. But Hezekiah, he's getting a little age on him. After about a year or 2 years after she passes away, he's getting a little older, and he needs somebody to make his biscuits and probably wash his underwear, that kind of thing. So he gets married a second time, and through his second marriage, they have kids, and that's when the quilt is actually passed down through that line. And it's actually said that, when this was an agreement with the family, that this story had to be told when showing the quilt. So it's a beautiful quilt, beautiful love story. And our boss, Miss Nancy, she's an amazing woman. She's my mentor. I love her dearly. She has this little quote that I love to say every time I tell the story of the quilt. And she always says, so Maggie and Hezekiah, they didn't have any kids. Like I said, he only had kids with his second marriage. But what she always says is what Maggie and Hezekiah didn't leave in a bloodline, they left stitched in a quilt. So that's a beautiful love story that I love to talk about, Maggie and Hezekiah Locklear.
And if you look, it gets its name. If you look at the square, it's sort of hard to tell here, but it looks like the bottom of a pine cone. And that's why it's called the pine cone patch. And that has sort of become the adopted
Tribal seal.
Tribal logo.
seal.
You'll see it on the girls' dancing dresses when they do powwows and things like that.
Yes. Forgot to mention that.
So, our last little part I want to talk about is federal recognition. I'm sure those of you who are local here that have heard the news over and over again about federal recognition for the tribe. The tribe has never received funding through the Indian Bureau of Affairs or the Indian Health Services, although they have worked since to get full, true federal recognition since 1888. In 1935, they got a memo from the U.S. Department of Interior stating that those who could prove 1/2 or more Indian blood could receive employment, education, and reservation benefits. So, in their wisdom, the federal government sent down a Harvard anthropologist to test 209 members of the tribe. And you had to have a certain type of hair, your eyes, the structure of your face. But what they used was an Indian from out west. I want to say he was Navajo. Don't hold me to that. But they took his features, and that's what they deemed as a true Indian. So if you met those requirements. So they did things like running a pencil through their hair. And if it ran through all the way through, then they had Indian hair, because the Indians in the Western Plains had straight hair. They measured their noses, their eye sockets, and everything. And it was found that only 22 people qualified. I sort of call them the sacred 22, and they did receive funding.
Or the original 22.
Yeah, the original 22. I call them the sacred 22. But anyway, Ben is actually descended from
One of those 22.
one of those
members,
22.
yeah.
But they received benefits for a short amount of time, but not for very long. So several other bills for strategies for obtaining support for the Lumbee were introduced in Congress. And it wasn't until 1956 that there was the Lumbee Act. And it was designated to the Indians living in Robeson County and the adjoining counties. And they received recognition, but the final sentence in the bill states that the act did not make them eligible for any federal services offered to Indians. However, the federal laws affecting Indians did not apply to them. So it was like, okay, we recognize you, but you don't get any of the benefits any of the other tribes get, which is seen, as something very bad. But what lots of people don't realize is that same year, 8 tribes lost federal recognition. All of a sudden, the government said, okay, you're not Indians anymore, so you don't get any more funding. So in 1978, there was a set of mandatory criteria for what a tribe had to do to get federal recognition. So the Lumbee spent 7 years preparing their 3-volume petition and submitted it in 1987, going by everything that they had been laid out for them. 2 years later, the Bureau of Indian Affairs solicitor writes to them and says, we were wrong. You shouldn't have even filled out the application because of that law from 1956, we can't let you be Indians anyway. We can't give you funding. You can't be. So between 1988 and 2003, there have been 12 bills put forward in the Senate and the House to get that last sentence of the bill taken out. It has been fought all those years. One of the people, of course, fighting it, if we go back to 1913, who we talked about in 1913 that got mad at the Lumbees, were the Cherokee Indians up in the mountains.
Yeah.
So they had been the biggest proponent fighting the Lumbees' recognition all these years. But it's interesting, some of the other tribes, like the Chewan Indians, the Catawba Indians, they were actually in Pembroke a couple of weeks ago, and they're working with the Lumbees on trying to get federal recognition. I'm going to let Ben. Ben wants to talk about a couple of our artifacts we brought, and then y'all feel free to come up here and look at the things that we have.
So I'm going to carry some of this stuff. If you want, though, you can hold up one of these and talk about it.
Okay.
But I'm going to go around, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning of my talk when I first started the first time. So these are some artifacts that were found in and around Robeson County. And so if you look, I'm going to go around, but these are some arrowheads. This is actually a spear point. So this is actually, it would have been too heavy to put that on the end of an arrow. So these are...
Yeah, well, we actually have been told as arrowheads all these years are not actually arrowheads, they're spearheads.
Spear points, yeah. This is a piece of pottery. This is actually a chunky stone. And so what chunky, I'll go around and like I said, and I'll show you guys. But chunky is actually in a traditional game that southeastern native people played. And so basically and chunky stones are very sentimental to native people, I guess. Chunky stones have been found in burial places of native people. So they held them very dear. I believe, too, if I'm not mistaken, that chunky stones were also passed down generation by generation. But basically how you would play it is they would take a round stone like this, smooth it out as best they could. They would roll it, chunk it, roll it on the ground. And as it rolled, they would take sticks, spears, basically, and they would try and hit the stone as it rolled. There would be two players or three. There would be a thrower, and then there would be two people on each side of the thrower with sticks. As they rolled it, they would throw it and try and hit it. If they hit it, that would be a certain amount of points. But if they didn't, whichever stick landed closest was also a certain amount of points. So it was a fun game to play, but it also, it honed in on those hunting skills. Hunting small prey such as, squirrels, rabbits, whatever it may have been. It would have been allowed you to practice, by throwing that spear and trying to hit this rock. You could imitate a rabbit, a squirrel, what have you. That sort of thing. This is actually a gorget. So gorgets were actually worn as like necklaces, and it would have been seen as people who... I might have to turn this down and I can just speak. But gorgets were actually used to signify superiority, so only high-class members of tribes or clans really would have worn gorgets.
And this is probably one of my favorite pieces in our, this is a teaching collection that we take around to schools. But this is a carved pipe shaped like a woodpecker. So they would have had a wooden stem coming out here. Birds were a very big thing revered by Native Americans because they lived on two planes. They lived on earth and in the sky. Of course, one bird in particular can live on all three, which is a duck. They are on land, water, and air. So, it was reviving when we got over there. Does anybody have any questions? I know we've given you a lot of information. I hope you've enjoyed what we said. I do want to close. This is the statement that I always close all my programs with. My cousin was the governor of North Carolina in the 1920s, and he wrote an extensive book called Lumber River Scots. And in that is one of my favorite quotes, and it says, "He deserves he only deserves to be remembered who treasures up and preserves the history of his ancestors. That was Edmund Burke. And that's what I sort of see myself as doing. Not only my ancestors, but I try to cover all Robinson County and southeastern North Carolina's ancestors. So, yes.
About how many Lumbees are there today?
There are 53,000 enrolled. And they're all across the country. That's not just in this immediate area. Because lots of times we'll have people come in where they're coming in to renew their tribal card. They'll come in the museum. So just since I've been there, the past 6 months, we've had lots of people from Texas. We had a really nice group. There was a guy who made baskets who they called Blind John. What was his name? No, Blind Cleveland Oxendine. But his daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter came into the museum and to see his collection of baskets that we had, and it was the daughter had not been there probably 20 years. The granddaughter had been there maybe about 30 years ago, and the great-granddaughter had never been in. So it was great that we had this whole generational group come in. But yeah, so about 53,000 enrolled right now.
What is the benefit of being part of the 53,000? Enrollment fee.
Well, it's a kinship thing. They're, like I said, they don't get federal funds from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but there is funding through other programs because, like, there's funding for housing. They'll go in and help repair housing. They have funding for apartment buildings, so they actually built complexes for the Indians and all. So.
A question out of ignorance. Excuse me, a question out of ignorance. I'm puzzled by all the research that's been done